Mic test. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 5th annual Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. It's grown a little bit each year, and so this year we thought we'd get a hall for 700 people. So we didn't quite get 700 people, but we do have a bigger crowd than we had last year. It's grown every year, and so there seems to be a growing interest in the ancient wisdom, and we thank you all for being here. I'd like to extend an especially warm welcome. Excuse me. Yeah? Well, I'm kind of busy right now. Oh, that's great. Great news. Okay. No, I'll get back to you later. Thanks. Bye. It's just a reminder that the surf is very good down there right now, and please turn off your cell phones. Ancient cultures around the world spoke of history or consciousness moving in a vast cycle of time with alternating dark and golden ages. And they said that it did so in one precession of the equinox, one eon. And Plato called it the Great Year, and this was a myth common to over 30 ancient cultures, and we now find it in over 200 myths. And many of these cultures had no contact with each other. Today, science teaches that there is no cycle, there was no golden age, that precession is some obscure wobbling of the earth, and it has nothing to do with anything. So the difference in views here couldn't be farther apart. Today, over the course of today and tomorrow, you will hear a dozen authors, scientists, independent researchers give their points of view on this topic. And I hope you'll find that there's something very important to learn, to understand, some wisdom that we can reap from the ancients and use in our lives to make a better world today. So I've got just a couple of notes here they wanted me to go over. We take the house lights down just a pinch for this talk right here. They told me to remind you that there's no food or drink allowed in here. I think water's okay. And we hope that you parked in P207 and P208. Is that right, Jeff? Because those are free. And we'd prefer it if you don't use flash photography or video cameras while the sessions are going here. There will be DVDs and recordings available after the show in the book room. I think they're at the end of each day. And these, there's some steps down here, and we've noticed that they're a little hard to see. So if you do walk down front, just please be careful. Last year I mentioned that we'd update everybody on the Galileo Awards. They ended at December 31st, 2007. And we had one paper accepted in the precession category that won the $25,000 category, and that was by Uwe Hohmann. And it makes a pretty good argument that precession is a non-local phenomenon. And then there were about 6 honorable mentions, and I think 1 or 2 of those might be available today in poster board form, and then some of them will appear on our website or at posters in future years. There's been a lot of news on the solar system in the last year or so. This article was out in March, and as you can see, NASA is baffled by these unexplained forces that are acting on our space probes. For a long time, it was thought that this was just an anomaly that had to do with Pioneer 10 and 11. They were the first 2 satellites to go out to the very far reaches of our solar system. And that was about 10 years ago that was discovered. But now they've found quite a number of others. In fact, on the 6 flybys, they've confirmed that there's 5 of them are in an anomalous behavior. In fact, the 6th one also had an anomalous behavior, but it was statistically very small compared to the others. And apparently what's happening is if the flyby orbits are asymmetrical to the rotation of the Earth, then you get a big anomalous effect, versus if they're in sync with the, or close to the equator, then the anomaly is much smaller. So a fellow at JPL has been working on this, John Anderson, and he believes that it has something to do with the Earth's rotation, but they're not quite sure what. So that's a story we'll be following carefully. And I also said I'd report on Gravity Probe B. I think it'll end up getting a better grade in the future, by the way. What they were looking for, they put this satellite up above the so-called wobbling Earth, and I thought it would be a great experiment to show that the whole solar system is moving, and this produces the observable we know as precession. However, they weren't looking for that. They were looking for just a small relativistic effect, and they found that they're getting some unexpected torques here on the gyroscopes. These are the finest gyros ever built. And so we believe that that might be the effect that we're looking for. The data was supposed to be released to the public really 1.5 years ago, and then as late as just a few months ago, and now it's pushed off till the end of next year. But hopefully we can get that and find out what's going on here. And then finally there was some news out of MIT after the conference last year. The results from the Voyager 1 and 2 came in. These are also quite far out there. They've reached the edge of the magnetosphere, the heliosphere, and they found that a couple of surprising things. One, that the heliosphere is not a sphere after all. It's a little more bullet-shaped, and it's distorting it, they think, due to these magnetic fields. And the second is that the temperature is much different out there. They found that it's warmer inside our little cocoon where our solar system is, and you can see 10 times cooler outside. And so we don't know what that means, but I'm just trying to show that we have some very good scientists out there with some excellent instruments that are working very hard to kind of figure out what's going on here with our solar system. And what we're finding always doesn't meet our expectations or our present theories. And I think that we'll be hearing something in the next few years that'll shed some light on precession. And personally, I believe it'll confirm what some of the ancient cultures had to say. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. He's a guy that I've only met a couple times, but somebody I want to get to know better, David Hatcher Childress. And he's written about 20 books or so. He's an adventurer. He's been called the real-life Indiana Jones. He's got some crazy stories. He told us one yesterday about some folks trying to kill him when he was going on one of his trips through Africa. But on these trips, he's discovered some really neat stuff, and he's going to share with you today many of his slides from his trips and adventures and some of the commonalities between ancient cultures, as well as talk about the mysterious Olmec culture, which is the subject of his new book. Would you please welcome David Hatcher Childress. Good luck, David.
Thanks, Walter. All right, well, get me going, and thanks. We'll need that. All right, well, it's great to be here at CPAC. It's my first time to come, and I usually like to tell a little bit about myself. Okay. I'm an American. I was born in France. My parents are Americans. Like you, I've always been interested in archaeology, history, unusual things. And I began traveling around the world at an early age. I went to grade school in Durango, Colorado, later high school in Missoula, Montana. I was a technical climber. I had dual interests in camping, climbing, wanting to go to the Himalayas, always interested in esoteric things. Got a good dose of Johnny Quest cartoons when I was a little kid. And it really got me going. I wanted to climb in the Himalayas, go to monasteries in Tibet, go up the Amazon and find lost cities in the jungles and stuff like that. And I was kind of fortunate in that I actually was able to do a lot of those things. And I started out by being an English teacher in Taiwan back in the mid-'70s. And that got me going. I ended up traveling all through Asia for years, even hitchhiking through Afghanistan and places like that. Later, I lived in Africa for 2.5 years, worked for an oil company in Sudan, traveled all down through Central Africa to South Africa, where I worked in a camping store selling camping equipment. Eventually, I went back to India and yachts and things like that, became one of the first backpackers through China when they first opened up, and I had studied Mandarin at the University of Montana. Eventually, then, I turned my attention to South America and Central America and Pacific Islands, and that's a bit what you're going to see today. I'm the author, too, of a number of books, including these Lost Cities books. And so, buckle your seatbelts, and we'll go for a wild ride into the world of the Olmecs. One of the first things I want to say about the Olmecs is that the Olmecs are really, they're on both the Pacific and Atlantic sides of Mexico. And this is something that a lot of people don't get. The main area of the Olmecs where the colossal heads come from is this area here on the Gulf of Mexico, La Venta, Comacalco, other areas all along the coast. But you'll see as we go along that the Olmecs originally apparently started on the Pacific coast. And the Olmecs were all up the Pacific coast here and down into Central America. But what's important to notice is what's called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And this is the narrowest part of southern Mexico. And in fact, this was one of 3 places that was thought of for building a Panama Canal that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Panama being one area, Nicaragua being the second, and then this area of Mexico, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Right in the middle of this is Oaxaca and Monte Alban, which are, in fact, Olmec cities. The Olmecs are one of the most recent civilizations that we know. I mean, I say recent in that we've discovered them most recently. Until really 1940, the Olmecs were not known. Some of the early colossal heads were discovered before that, but it was really in the late 1930s with the Smithsonian and the Museum of the American Indian, where they started looking at certain art that was coming out of Mexico, and they were realizing it wasn't Mayan. And at that point, they coined the term Olmecs, decided that there was a precursor civilization to the Mayans, and they called them the Olmecs. They then convened in Mexico City in 1940, in December 1940 into January 1941, a big conference there where they brought archaeologists from all over the world and Mayanists, and they basically introduced the Olmecs. And they said, yes, there's another culture, it's pre-Mayan, and they are the Olmecs. And what was happening then was around in the 1940s, they started digging up what we call the colossal heads. And these are basalt heads. They weigh around 20 tons, and they were found buried in the swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco in Mexico, on the Atlantic coast. One of the early Mexican archaeologists was a guy named Matthew Sterling. He was an American and who lived in Mexico for a long time. He began studying the Olmec heads. Now, early on, they realized with these colossal heads made out of basalt that they were very finely carved, they had wide noses, thick lips, and that they thought, yeah, very African, shall we say. This is La Venta, pyramid site there that's near the coast in Tabasco area. There's about 20 known of the colossal heads. Now, also, at La Venta, as they began excavating, they found that it was an extremely well-made city. It had drainage systems and water systems that were highly sophisticated. A Mexican archaeologist, his name was Ignacio Bernal. He became really the expert on the Olmecs. One of the things I found as I began researching the Olmecs about 10 years ago, that very, very few books had ever been written about the Olmecs. And Ignacio Bernal's book, which came out in like 1968, was really the first of all of the Olmec heads, or books on Olmecs. The Olmecs, megalithic culture, working with extremely heavy and hard basalt and granite. A lot of very distinctive things about the Olmecs, aside from the African kind of look to many of them, but they don't all look like that. Also things like the flaming eyebrows, there's what they call the were-jaguar look. The Olmecs very much into jade, like the Chinese, also into psychedelic mushrooms and hallucinogenics, and also characteristic things with babies and the frowning look on the babies' heads. Many of the Olmec scenes are them holding babies in front of them. These babies always have this characteristic frown. They're often wearing these masks, other kind of fancy headdresses on top of them. This is a famous big Olmec slab. He's known as the ambassador. He actually doesn't look like an African. He looks more like some Phoenician or Middle Eastern guy. He's wearing a turban. He has a beard and a mustache. And in fact, this slab here is one of the earliest of Olmec writings and hieroglyphs. There's 3 early hieroglyphs here, and there's another one over here that's a foot that's hard to see. But he's called the ambassador. So here already we have a guy who, rather than looking African, is having the beard and the mustache like some European guy. Almost everything now that was originally ascribed to the Mayans, the count, the calendar, the hieroglyphic system, even the ball game and all that, they're now saying all originally developed with the Olmecs, including the hieroglyphic system. And the Olmecs had the early hieroglyphic things. We can't read them. Also, this is an Olmec statuary. These are known as Atlantean figures because they're holding up a rooftop like Atlas. So they call it Atlantean. And they also here are wearing the helmets like the colossal heads, and they look very much like some kind of Africans. And in fact, when you look at a lot of the big Olmec heads, they really look like kind of Nigerian rugby players or something like that. Now, what are the other things about the Olmecs? The Olmecs are much farther south, too. They're in Guatemala. And many of the early Guatemalan researchers and archaeologists, what they did was dig up on the Pacific coast of Guatemala and El Salvador. They would also dig up these giant basalt figures, very round, much more crudely made than what we call the colossal heads, but they're also Olmec. And Olmec figures, in fact, go well into Central America, all the way down to Costa Rica and Panama. Here also, these are Olmec heads that are found. They're just found buried in these farms and things like that on the Pacific side of Guatemala. What happens is bulldozers and things go out to clear farmland for these sugarcane fields, and they find these giant heads and boulders. And these things are weighing 10 to 20 tons. Some of these farms out there in Guatemala would actually just create a little shed, and they just put these giant heads and stuff in them. And some of them, like this guy, has a sort of Egyptian headdress kind of thing on him. And we'll see a lot of that as we go along, more sort of Egyptian type guys like this. This is also an Olmec head from Guatemala. He's wearing a very, very elaborate headdress on him. He's looking, and it's so interesting to look at the facial features of all these Olmecs as we go along. We'll see. This is an Olmec guy too, also from Guatemala. He's wearing a mask. Early Proto-Mayan hieroglyphs here on this. This is a stele, like you would find in the Mayan areas and Egypt and stuff like that. They would carve. They were extremely good artists and rock carvers, making this giant tiger statue. The Olmecs were big into jade, and this jade birdman is from Costa Rica. Very classic Olmec figure. And part of, when you look at a lot of the Olmec heads, particularly statuary, they are this dolicephalus or they have the cranial deformation. We're going to see a lot of that. Even down also in Costa Rica, you have this hunchback look of the Olmecs. And in fact, this is in the Southwest, the very famous figure called Kokopelli. He's a hunchback. He's a good luck figure. And that, too, is an early Olmec kind of a thing. He's this Olmec. He has the cranial deformation. He's a hunchback. And in fact, at the main museum in Costa Rica, this is a very, very famous figure. And they put him on the brochures and stuff for the museum, and it's known that he's an Olmec figure. The Olmecs, in fact, probably went down to South America, and we'll get into that too. Also, the time frame of the Olmecs, we know now, starts at around 1,300 BC. It's the same time as, say, the Akhenaten, Nefertiti era of Egypt, as well as the Shang dynasty in China. Now, I want to go real quick into some of construction, a megalithic construction, and it's what we call Keystone Cuts. This is from a National Geographic in the 1940s, the building of the Parthenon, and in it I found it was a good one because they're using keystone cuts and clamps here. So we'll go on to that. The idea of this megalithic construction, this is actually in Cuzco in Peru. You have this polygonal jigsaw construction that's very fine. You have the little knobs and things like that. Lots of angles. This is the famous stone of 12 angles. It's in Cuzco. Appears on the beer label of the Cusqueña beer. Fine construction, perfectly fit, no mortar. And this is your kind of earthquake-proof construction where you have this jigsaw blocks, and they're fitted together very well and notched. This kind of construction is actually found all over the world. This is the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo. And it's the same kind of this polygonal, megalithic construction made out of granite, fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle. When the shock waves of an earthquake hit these walls, they move independently, but they're locked in together. The same kind of construction is found at an unusual site in northwest Greece, near Albania, at a place called the Necromanticon. Necromanticon was a structure that was underground, and it wasn't really found until the 1960s by Greek archaeologists. But it, too, is this same kind of polygonal, notched blocks perfectly fitted together. Back to Peru and Cuzco, Sacsayhuaman, that's above, still made out of limestone and other pieces, and granite as well. It too is these locked jigsaw pieces locked in together. Machu Picchu, the most popular tourist destination in South America, it's also a megalithic city. As you go around Machu Picchu, you will see areas where there's very fine megalithic construction, these same blocks notched in. You see the knobs and things like that. These walls pulling apart. This is also at Machu Picchu. Again, lots of big lichen patches in here. Perfect megalithic construction, the notching, the fitting together of these really fine granite blocks. Now, I've maintained in my books that the Incas were the inheritors of these megalithic buildings, and they lived in them, but they didn't actually build them. And in my mind, the proof of that is a place on the Urubamba River, which is near to Machu Picchu. It's a place called Ollantaytambo. And at Ollantaytambo, there's a sun temple up here at the top. You go up these stairs up here, this terracing, and you get up into this area. As you get up into that area, what you're going to find is, again, the perfect fitting, megalithic blocks, notching, the curious knobs, and things like that. Here again, these walls coming through. But then as you get up to the top, you start seeing some very unusual things. You see giant blocks of andesite, like this, at Ollantaytambo. All right? Huge blocks that have been cut and dressed, and then there's one area where there's one complete wall like this. This is the main area of the Sun Temple here. It's unusual construction, too, because of these very thin pieces of granite with the huge blocks. This is mainly what tourists see when they come here, is this wall right here. But then as you walk around the corner, you suddenly see some unusual things. You see these giant blocks here that are coming along the side. And so, now, this is mainstream archaeologists and the experts that I battle in my books, basically. And they're saying that the Incas built this, and they built these walls and these cities only about 200 years before the Spanish arrived in Peru to conquer Peru. The Incas are very contemporary with our own modern European culture. Now, here's what they're saying. That the Incas then dragged this giant block up, and they notched it right here, and here's a straight line, but then the Incas just filled it in with this crummy construction. This is pre-Inca construction, in my mind. This is Inca construction. Now, this is how it looks today. This is how it looked when the Spanish arrived in Peru and Ollantaytambo, and this is how it looked in Inca times too, just like this. Giant blocks scattered around. They were perhaps part of a wall, or they were never actually finished constructing it. And then you have these walls here, you have the big blocks, and then you have this crummy construction filling it in. Now, according to mainstream archaeologists, this was all done by the Incas 200 years before the Spanish got there. As you look at some of these blocks that are standing around here, you're going to see really finely cut and articulated corners and things like that. I mean, they're really cutting these things to fit these giant 20-ton, 50-ton, even 100-ton blocks of granite together. Now, one of the real telltale things here is these. This is the Keystone Cuts for clamps. And they're on these blocks at Ollantaytambo. But these kind of blocks, this kind of a clamp, I mean, when you use this kind of a thing, a keystone cut and a clamp, you have to have another block next to it, the same kind of clamp, and then you're going to pour molten metals into this. And these are huge blocks, too. You wouldn't think they would be going anywhere. But in fact, after they fitted these things together, they then wanted to pour these metal clamps in. So wherever you have a metal clamp like this on a block, you're going to have another block next to it for that. We'll now jump a few hundred miles to the south to Tiwanaku in Bolivia. Here's the famous Gate of the Sun coming down. This has actually been moved from its original position at Puma Punku. On this side, you see it's coming down. You see how the wall, another wall would have fit into this. It too would have been cut with a notching here to be fit in there. The guys are also wearing turbans at Tiwanaku. At Tiwanaku as well, there's a whole hydraulic system that's part of it. There's tunnels going all throughout Tiwanaku and underneath it. Water apparently was diverted from nearby rivers and Lake Titicaca. Water poured through the city. And apparently it was a huge metallurgical center that was for washing ores and probably for creating iron, copper, other metals and stuff like that. This is the famous Kon-Tiki Viracocha statue that's at Tiwanaku. Thor Heyerdahl made a big deal of him. His name is Kon-Tiki Viracocha. He's got a mustache and a beard. And he's holding his hands in the very tiki fashion that you see in Tahiti and New Zealand a lot, and that's a hand over your heart or your stomach like this, one way or another. You're holding the positions of your hands over your stomach and your heart. That's known as the tiki position. And if you buy actually small tiki pendants in New Zealand, Tahiti, and places like that, their hands will always be in that position. At Tiwanaku, the Acabana Reservoir was one of the largest pyramid complexes. It's largely been destroyed. There was a huge lake in the middle of it that they had hydraulically brought water and then pumped it up to the lake as a reservoir, and then they used it to wash throughout the city. As you go about a mile towards Lake Titicaca, you come to the area known as Puma Punku. Puma Punku has all of these giant andesite blocks. Some of these weigh like 1,000 tons. They're just scattered around like some kid's building blocks. This whole thing's been destroyed. And what you'll see there, again, are these Keystone Cuts, and where the metallic clamps would be poured in. And we saw these at Ollantaytambo too. Now, archaeologists know that Tiwanaku was not built by the Incas, that it's pre-Inca. The age of Tiwanaku is very controversial. It's thought to be at least 2,000 years old, say to 100 BC or something. It's probably much older than that. But here you have the Keystone Cuts. These are giant blocks. You wouldn't think that they would really be going anywhere, but like at Ollantaytambo, yeah, they're using these cuts. Right here, we're sort of seeing that probably the same builders of Cuzco, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Machu Picchu even, were these pre-Inca people. Once again, more of these Keystone Cuts. This is a really unusual way of fitting giant blocks together, pouring clamps, things like that. At Puma Punku too, here I'm with a British engineer named Christopher Dunn. He's looking at a block at Puma Punku which apparently has a saw mark and then has little drill holes in it, and he's measuring the precision and things like that. Chris is a pretty good friend of mine, and his belief is that at Tiwanaku, other areas too, like at Ollantaytambo and in Egypt, that they were using machining tools, power saws, power tools, he believes, to articulate many of these blocks. Typical trenching that archaeologists do, and this is also at Puma Punku, at Tiwanaku. Once again, you see the blocks fitting together, and here's where the metal clamps of the Keystone Cuts would go. As archaeologists there are digging this out, what they find is big blocks just standing on big columns of mud and muck. It's like some tidal wave just wiped out Puma Punku and Tiwanaku, just scattering giant blocks around, burying it under tons and tons of mud and muck. This is what one of the keystone clamps would look like. Okay, metal, molten metal poured into the two keystone cuts that are fitting together. They don't find these that often because earlier people, wandering tribes, anytime they see something like this, they're going to pry this out. Then they're going to probably make it into a spearhead or a sword or a dagger or something like that. Now we'll go briefly to Egypt. If you go to Karnak, other areas of Egypt, you will see keystone cuts. Same kind of thing. All the times these hourglass kind of cuts. So they used keystone cuts and stuff in Egypt too. Just like at Ollantaytambo and Tiwanaku. This wall at Edfu is interesting too because it's actually a dynastic Egyptian wall, but it's been made of older blocks that have keystone cuts in them. But they were definitely not part of this wall originally. You wouldn't ever have keystone cuts really on a vertical wall. They have to be on a horizontal wall so they can pour molten metal into it. And in fact, many of the keystone cuts and things like that, they're over here. There's not a corresponding block. This has been looted from some other building, older building, and then used to build what would be like a dynastic building. Early Bolivian archaeologists wanted to reconstruct Puma Punku, and these are some of the designs that came of what these buildings actually look like. Giant walls, perfectly fitted together, blocks that were uniform, almost machined or something, and they would fit together almost like Lego blocks, only they were, 1-ton granite blocks and stuff like that would fit. Other ideas of these huge walls, how it was. At Tiwanaku, what a lot of these guys looked like, they also wore turbans. This guy here, he looks very much like an Aymara type Indian, now lives in the highlands. They often had tattoos, other kind of facial piercings, nose studs, studs in their lips and stuff like that. These guys are also from Tiwanaku. This guy here, he looks very Oriental, very kind of Chinese. Here's another Tiwanaku guy. He's got a mustache and a beard. American Indians really don't have facial hair. They don't need to shave. They can't really grow beards and mustaches. Around this area too, you start to see these dolicephalous skulls. You have the whole head binding thing. Huge skulls that are sometimes 3 times the size of a normal human skull. They would very elongated skull. These are in Peru near Ica along the coast. Some of these guys really looked pretty strange and not the kind of guy you want to meet in a dark alley probably. Other skulls too found in Peru. This guy had he was trepanned, had his head cut open, a gold plate put in it, and he totally survived this, went on to live. So you have a lot of operations like this. Many of these guys and the mummies that you found in the deserts of Peru, they have like red hair and things like that. Like this too is a skeleton from Peru. He has red hair. Along that area too, Pisco, and this is what they called the Candlestick of the Andes. This was on a hill, and it was basically a signal for seafarers. As they were coming down the coast of Peru, they would see this, and it basically meant, yeah, this is the place. You're at Paracas, essentially. Now, the Olmecs did this too. The Olmecs also had the cone heads. They were doing the head binding. This is a well-known feature of the Olmecs especially, in fact. At Comacalco, which is on the Gulf Coast, lots of statuary of Olmecs. This is what these guys look like. They had the extended deformed cranium that was coming out. They tended to have sort of Oriental eyes. While Olmecs had many features, they tended to look like a cross between Africans and Chinese. They did a lot of the head deformation. This guy had his head squashed in, actually, and this one. And so we know that, we don't know why they did this, the head deformation, the cranial deformation. There are ways to do it. They were imitating other people, perhaps. Some have said, oh, well, you know, they wanted to look like extraterrestrials. Some said they were extraterrestrials. But we know that there is a way to deform the cranium when you're, when you're quite young and you're a baby, the plates in your head have not fused yet. And so you can then you can pressure and you can squash the head. The Olmecs were doing all this. And here we go. We'll look at some of the famous colossal heads, the wide noses, very finely made, the thick lips. These guys, there's about 20 of these giant colossal heads like this. They all seem to be wearing some kind of a helmet on them. Mainstream archaeologists are saying these guys are just American Indians. Some American Indians had Negroid features or something in this area, and that just became accented. Other Olmec guys are looking like this. And this is another curious thing about the Olmecs. They would often be in this, what's called the quizuo position, this position of you're kneeling with your hands on your knees. It's called quizuo. It's another oddball position. This guy's quite interesting. He's also wearing kind of like an Egyptian headdress. And he's got this some kind of a box or something on his forehead. Orthodox Jews do this today, where they take pieces of the Torah, put them in a little box, put them on their forehead, and then go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem and pray. I mean, stuff like this is still being done today. And curiously, the Olmecs apparently did stuff like that too. Other Olmec heads are still in parks and stuff, in areas of mainly on the Atlantic coast. Some have been taken out of Mexico City. This guy's an Olmec statue. Notice here the kind of mohawk haircut of these guys. A lot of them have these facial tattoos. He's got also the special frown that they're known for, the Olmecs. Another one of the Olmec colossal heads. This guy's an Olmec too. He's known as the wrestler or the rower. Now, he's an Olmec, but he doesn't look like the colossal heads. He looks like he's some Phoenician or Mediterranean guy. He also has a beard and a mustache and stuff like that. They often say he's the wrestler, but he could be a rower, and he's rowing perhaps a boat. Another one of the colossal heads. I mean, this is just so typical of how they look, these things. But now here's another Olmec colossal head. I call this the Sci Fi Head. Very well made. Just his eyes is very, very strange. Very articulated. Quite unusual looking guy. Here's another Olmec. He's wearing what they call the Jaguar Face. He has the typical Olmec frown that the Olmecs are specially noticed for. And this thing, what they call the V cleft on his head. This baffled archaeologists and still does today. This is one of the other 20 known colossal Olmec heads. These things weigh like 20 tons. The time period, again, for these things is about 1,300 BC. And this is a really curious head because on it are all of these little pock marks. And I'll show you. This is the head, actually, in situ out in the swamps and whatnot of Veracruz. And here, these are really unusual. They cannot figure out what these are, and this is only on this one head. But it's these weird pock marks, and it's almost like, and this is basalt too, extremely hard stone. It's like someone with a power tool or kind of a grinder just went to this head and started just grinding little pock marks out of it. This totally baffles archaeologists now, how or why these pock marks are in it. This is another curious Olmec guy that's at the museum in Jalapa in Veracruz, where a lot of the good Olmec pieces are. He's a kind of a big boulder. He's a full-featured guy. He's wearing kind of a Egyptian headdress, and he also has apparently a false beard, as the Egyptians would wear too, these false beards and things right here. So he's an unusual character. The Olmecs had the rubber balls, and he's an Olmec, the whole ball game thing, and the ball games were played up into northern Arizona, up around the Grand Canyon, even right up the border of Utah. They were playing these ball games. He's holding a rubber ball. He's a statue. These are a bunch of Olmec guys. This is from Comacalco on the coast. This is like what these guys look like. All weird heads, weird goggle eyes, strange frowns. They had all kinds of weird tattooing and ritual scarring and facial weird features. This guy here looks very Chinese. This guy here too. This guy's kind of a Jaguar mask and stuff like that. This is a famous, they call it an offering. It's jade figures with jade celts or adzes. Here you can again see what these guys look like with their the elongated heads and stuff like that. Now the whole thing of this cranial deformation was actually a worldwide thing. It's something that when you read, there's very few books on the Olmecs, and my book is one of only about 10 that I've found that have ever been written on the Olmecs. But also, the Egyptians did this. This is actually Meketaten, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She's also got cranial deformation. Tutankhamun, he also was a cone head. He had cranial deformation too. Often they don't talk about that. You hear about them x-raying the mummy of Tutankhamun or something like that, but they never talk about him having this cone head cranial deformation. This is Tutankhamun, a statue that was found in his tomb. I mean, he too is one of these guys with these elongated heads. His cranial capacity is double, say, what would like a normal person. But this stuff was going on in Kurdistan. The Kurds did this. They found this skulls like this on Malta. In Africa, Vanuatu, and other Pacific islands, they still do this. This was in the Congo, taken by a Dutch anthropologist in the 1920s. This little kid, his head is bound. He's going to be a cone head with cranial deformation, things like that. Now, I mean, for the isolationists, they're saying, well, all these people are just isolated from each other. They don't have any connection. And when they do this, they just decided to do this on their own for their own reasons. But it would obviously seem, I think, that yeah, there's some connection here, and this worldwide thing of cranial deformation, of which the Olmecs particularly are known for, was something that happened on literally every continent. The Olmecs did all kinds of things. I mean, they had to have quite a sophisticated science with plumb bobs, hard tools for working with basalt. The Olmecs used boomerangs. Boomerangs were used by Egyptians too. We think today so much of boomerangs being an Australian Aboriginal kind of thing, but that was the Mexicans used boomerangs, the Olmecs. Egyptians hunted with boomerangs. Boomerangs have been found in Florida, Poland, Denmark. Boomerangs too are a worldwide phenomenon. The Hopi Indians in northern Arizona, they hunted with boomerangs too, and that's well known. Again, this guy's an Olmec. And he's playing with a ball. He's a soccer player, ball player. And it's like so much of what we do today, including tattooing, piercing, weird haircuts. They were doing all that stuff over 3,000 years ago. The Olmecs too, they found these strange round balls in many of the Olmec areas. If you go down to Costa Rica, they also found these round balls, perfectly round granite balls. They know they're man-made. Some of them are huge. They're as big as cars. They found him in the jungle in Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, it's the big archaeological enigma, and they're too associated with the Olmecs. Why they used these round balls, what was going on. Most of the round balls are found in this southwestern area of Costa Rica down here, including an island right over here. They're just washed up into jungle mountain areas. This is the border of Panama and stuff right here. So this is the area of those huge, giant round balls. They really don't know what they were for. The more indigenous peoples would then take the smaller round balls if they could and put them in tombs and things like that. But they don't know what they were for. A curious thing, I became really interested in these giant round balls all over the world. And then we have a magazine called World Explorer, and one of our readers he knew we were interested in all these round balls, so he said, oh, I have this old thing from Santa Monica. And when they were building this electric trolley, just at the turn of the century in Santa Monica, they had to take out this hill that was there. And they used this old steam shovel. And what they found in this hill were all these round balls and stuff. How about that? And in fact, at the time, they said, oh, well, they're dinosaur eggs, you know. So this was a real new one to me, 1908, that they found all these round balls in Los Angeles. If you go to Easter Island, you'll also find these weird round balls, the smaller ones. And in fact, on Easter Island, the most sacred of all of the objects there, including all the statues and stuff, is this one round ball right here. And it's on kind of the north coast of the island. It's got a container around it. But this ball is, I mean, on Easter Island is a special thing. And most tourists go to Easter Island, they never see this. But it's, yeah, this thing is, to Easter Island, is the most sacred thing on the whole island. As you go through Easter Island, which I'm just going to run through real briefly, all the strange statues, they're cone heads too. And the statues on Easter Island, they also have the cranial deformation. Here's one of the largest of the known statues on Easter Island. It's still in the quarry at Ranawaraku. And there's one statue on Easter Island that's in this quizuo position. And that is, you're on your knees, and you have your hands on your knees. You're kneeling down with your hands on your knees. And that is this statue here. And it's a well-known statue on Easter Island. This was, in fact, discovered by Thor Heyerdahl. But that is the quizuo position. And it's an unusual way for any statue to be. It was known in the Shang Chinese to do this. The Egyptians did it too, the quizuo posture. It's a kind of a posture too that is like you're subjugating yourself probably to some king or chief. You're kneeling in front of him. You're putting your hands on your knees, and even your head is bent forward a little bit, as if they could perhaps cut your head off or something. You're totally subjugating yourself to someone in this position. But this position was used by the Olmecs. It was used in the Shang, China. Shang dynasty of China is one of the earliest Chinese dynasty, and it's from also 1300 BC, the same time as the Olmecs. At Tiwanaku, also statues were found there in this quizuo position. Such an unusual position where you're on your knees with your hands on your knees. So you can look for that. Here's an Olmec statue in this position. At the Indus Valley areas of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro along the Pakistani-Indian border, also you find the quizuo position in statues. We're just coming out with a new book, too, called Axis of the World, which goes into the Rongo writing on Easter Island with also the Indus Valley writing. That kind of a writing, too, is this as the ox plows, bostophedron pattern. The Hittites also wrote in that manner. There's another strange statue on Easter Island. The Easter Island statues had big eyes. The statues were supposed to be alive. The eyes were inlaid like this, and a power came out of the eyes, according to the Easter Islanders. This shows you the size of some of the statues on Easter Island, just to give you an idea. And here's the quizuo statue. There's only one of these on Easter Island. These statues are just so huge, they're half buried, which kind of would indicate in my mind that these have been there for a long, long time. Archaeologists, though, again, tend to think these statues aren't that old. They're only maybe 500 years old, something like that. So these also on Easter Island are very fine construction. But this is the whole thing. As I get into my book with the mystery of the Olmecs, what becomes clear is that the Olmecs are a pan-oceanic culture. They were coming not only across the Atlantic, they were coming across the Pacific as well. And they were related to a lot of the ancient cultures that were in Southeast Asia. This is interesting, too, because this is this land bridge going from southern India to Sri Lanka. And this was rumored for a long time to be, they call it Rama's Bridge. But it's like a man-made road that's now underwater. And it's only been found by satellite photos. And it's a lot like the road out to Key West, where you have this long road going along a shallow chain of islands, and right here, and it connected originally in ancient times, southern India with Sri Lanka, but today it's underwater. As you go now into Southeast Asia, to Angkor Wat, other areas of Cambodia, you also see the Keystone Cuts. The same thing we saw at Tiwanaku, the same thing that we saw at Ollantaytambo near Machu Picchu, also in Egypt. Here also, Keystone Cuts at Angkor Wat. These are just like the ones in Egypt, where you have an hourglass type of a Keystone Cut. Japanese have been doing excavations at Angkor Wat and finding these clamps, the metal clamps that are part of the Keystone Cuts. This is like the most important thing to the Japanese archaeologists. And they're found in South America, they're found in Southeast Asia, they're found in Egypt, and in others. Now, just 1 year ago, I was in Vietnam, went to the megalithic site of Mai Son in Vietnam, and I was walking around with a guide, and I noticed Keystone Cuts there. And he had never seen them. And I took our guide over and I said, hey, do you see these Keystone Cuts and stuff right here? And he had never seen them, and I had to explain them to him. I said, yeah, these are Keystone Cuts, just like the ones at Tiwanaku and stuff like that. In fact, these are the T-shaped cuts. You're going to have another clamp here. You've got to pour molten clamps in there. You know, the guide, our own guide, had never even seen this, and he was like, wow, thanks for telling me. You know, I was like, yeah. So Keystone Cuts, again, you've got these in Vietnam. You got them in Cambodia. And in fact, those guys were Hindus. They worship Shiva and stuff like that. This is a statue from Mai Son. He's got a mustache. Also with thick lips. These guys, too, look a little bit like Olmecs. The area where these guys are of Mai Son, and these people were called the Cams, or Cam. And in fact, Cam was an ancient word for Egypt, Cam. And their main base was this island off of Vietnam, and it's right near Da Nang. And this was the demilitarized zone. I mean, right here, where Mai Son and all that, this was right the border of North and South Vietnam. A lot of the fighting was right there. American forces actually bombed that megalithic city. Other areas too, in Java, you would have megalithic building and even pyramids, much like the Olmecs and things like that. This was a megalithic building there in Borneo, where they're moving some giant megalith that probably already existed. But the whole idea, too, that what people were coming across the Pacific, they were crossing here, and the Olmecs definitely, by heading here into the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, coming across the whole Polynesian Triangle, coming through Melanesia. Melanesia here, these guys, this is all a kind of a Negroid area right here. And so even if you go to New Guinea, Melanesia, Solomon Islands, Fiji, you're going to see just people who also look like the Olmecs, as a matter of fact. Throughout Fiji, too, they wore turbans and things like that. They know that Lapita pottery found in Tonga and Fiji and stuff goes also back to 1000 BC. This is the time of the Olmecs going back. In Madagascar, too, giant megaliths, Egyptian navigation charts and stuff like that. Throughout the Pacific, many of the islands have the name Ra. Ra-Paiti, Ra-Iti, Ra this, Ra-Atea. And so here's the Egyptian sunwards. The Egyptian god Bes, who was the god of good luck and sailors and things like that. He was a hunchback. He was a deformed dwarf. He was a god of good luck. And in fact, this also, from the Cairo Museum, this is also Bes, right here. And this looks, if you've spent a lot of time in Pacific Islands, you'll see this is totally like in Tahiti and the Polynesian kind of things. So many of the tikis that you find in the South Pacific are apparently depictions, in my mind, of the Egyptian god Bes. some of the tattoos. Tonga, you also have all these pyramids and things like that. So as you went out across the Pacific, you were also finding these giant megalithic buildings, arches, and things like that. The whole idea in mainstream archaeology that people can't cross oceans in boats, that oceans are barriers. But in reality, oceans aren't barriers, oceans are highways. That's the easy way to go to places. This is a megalithic quarry, now partially underwater on Tonga. Huge Tonga canoes. Tonga was the only nation in the South Pacific that was not colonized because they still had the giant ships and were going around different places. And let's see, I think I've got just another minute or so. One of the strange things about the Olmecs was their obsession with babies, and the babies with frowns. Ignacio Bernal also noticed that many of the babies that were depicted didn't have any kind of genitals at all, and he wondered if they were eunuchs. These are all Olmec heads, looking very Chinese too. And having studied in China, this is a very typical Olmec young baby. He does have the deformed head. He has rather Oriental Chinese eyes. But again, he has no genitals. Gavin Menzies and other people in their 1421 and the whole thing of China, the emperor of China was always surrounded by eunuchs. And they were taken as babies and specially created. The penis and the testicles were removed. And the emperor of China was always surrounded. His ambassadors, his teachers, his viziers, his admirals and generals were all eunuchs. And Gavin Menzies talks about that in his book 1421 about the Chinese circumnavigating the world, and then is that those generals are eunuchs. And this was the thing this is what Bernal actually wondered too with the Olmecs. Were these Olmecs eunuchs? And in fact, this is also an Olmec thing here too with a jaguar dragon, and he's wearing a jade penis. So this was the strange thing with the Olmecs. Were the Olmecs sent over, like, from China? And many of the Olmec, the leaders, the chiefs, were apparently, and this is what I was able to conclude in the end, they were eunuchs. And this is one of the reasons why they were often very fat. They were chiefs and things like that. They could really have anything they want, but they couldn't have sex. But they would eat a lot. They would take hallucinogenic mushrooms and things like that. I mean, they would have fun as best they could. Which meant sort of eating, actually, and going to a lot of festivals. So yeah, and the final little thing here about the Olmecs is that you have the Olmec writing is the precursor writing to the Mayans. And they're still trying to figure this out. This was the Smithsonian Institution that took the statue. But what eventually happened, and I found this finally, in 1995, the top Chinese scholar of Shang Dynasty early Chinese writing, which is like, this is oracle and a tortoise bone with Chinese oracle writing. And in 1995, the top scholar from China went to Mexico City to look at certain writing on these jade celts here. And he was told, and this is very early Olmec writing, and that scholar proclaimed at the time, and this was only reported in U.S. News and World Report. You can still find this online, and it's in my book on Mystery of the Olmecs. But he confirmed, he said, the early Olmec writing that was found on these jade figures was Shang Chinese oracle writing. So here, the top Chinese scholar was saying that, yeah, early Olmec writing was Shang Chinese. And that is my presentation. Thank you.